Hello, my friends. Welcome to my corner. I recently heard about an author from Bolivia who is getting quite a bit of attention. His name is Rodrigo Hasbún, and I wanted to experience his work. So, as usual, I went into my library's database. I realized that they had a few books by him, and there was one that they had both in the original, in Spanish, and also in English translation. I looked him up. I liked the synopsis. I also realized that it had the approval of Andres Neumann, an author that I really admire and that I really like. So I thought, why not? So today, my friend, we are going to explore Los Afectos or Affections by Rodrigo Hasbún. I want to tell you about this very, very brief novel and my experience with it. So when I say brief, I am talking really brief here. This is only 130 pages in length, so it's very manageable. It's something that you can read probably in one sitting. It was published in 2015 and the English translation was published in 2016, so that is pretty quick, for publication of a translation. This is Rodrigo Hasbún's second novel. He has so far 3 novels and also 3 collections of short stories. Now, Affections is a book where the characters and the events that are described are historical, but the author makes it very clear in a note at the beginning, before the novel begins, that this is a work of fiction. So it is about the Ertl family. These were Germans who moved to Bolivia after the fall of the Nazi regime. So the characters that we have here are Hans, the father, then Aurelia, the mother, and then their daughters. We have Heidi, Monica, and Trixie. And there are other characters, of course, that interact with them. So let me tell you first a little bit about Hans, who is the father. He is a filmmaker, and he actually worked as a cameraman for Leni Riefenstahl. This is in real life and also in the fictional world of the novel. So in Bolivia, what he is doing is to look for the mythical city of Paititi, which is supposed to be in the Amazon jungle, and he hopes to find some treasure there. So as you can see by what I'm saying, the view of Hans of the continent of Latin America is the perspective of the conquistador. He sees the land as something that has to be controlled, something that has to be subdued. So as I read that from the perspective of Hans, what I kept thinking about was the movie by Werner Herzog, Aguirre, The Wrath of God, because that is the kind of approach to the land, approach to Latin America that we have here with this character. Then we have the older daughter, Heidi. She is torn between 2 men. One of them is the one that she eventually marries. His name is Hans, just like her father. And then we also have Hans's brother, who is a more interesting character. His name is Reinhard. And why do I say that he is more interesting? Well, he has more of a political conscience. For example, he is worried about the native inhabitants of Bolivia. Eventually, Heidi returns to Germany. She goes there with Hans. They have a family, they have kids, so it's like her stay in Latin America was a temporary thing. Then we have the younger daughter, Trixie, and she's a character that is growing, really, basically, as we encounter the story. She is coming of age. She's trying to figure out what kind of woman she is going to be. At one point, we see her accompanying her father in a filmmaking expedition there in Latin America. But for the most part, she is a character that is basically just experiencing the shift, the passage from being a child into being an adolescent and eventually into being a woman. So the most important character to me would be Monica. And you may have heard of her, Monica Ertl, because she is the one who was responsible for assassinating Roberto Quintanilla Pereira. And Roberto Quintanilla Pereira was the man who was historically responsible, I would say, for making the decision to cut off the hands of Che Guevara. So this is all historical, but once again, the author makes it very clear that this is a work of fiction. Many people have called Monica Ertl Che Guevara's Avenger. So that is the character that we have here. She gets involved at one point with a guerrilla fighter. His name is Inti, and he, as a matter of fact, narrates one of the parts, one of the chapters of this book, or 2. We have his perspective at a couple of moments, and this guy, Inti, actually fought with Che Guevara. So when Monica gets involved with Inti, through that involvement, she also becomes involved with the struggle. She becomes a fighter too. And because she is the character that I would say, develops more dramatically in this text, I consider her to be the protagonist of the novel. And I believe that we are meant to consider her the central character by the way the story is narrated. Let's talk a little bit about structure and style. So as I said, this book is really brief. It's 130 pages long, both in the English and in the Spanish translation. It's almost exactly the same. And the story itself is divided into two parts. We get 12 chapters plus a kind of epilogue. And the structure here is really interesting because we keep shifting perspectives. Each of the little brief chapters is narrated by a different character. So what you get here is a kind of Faulknerian mosaic, if you allow me to describe it that way. And here's the cool thing. In terms of the perspective of the narrator, we alternate between first, second, and third person narration. So we have a really, really interesting mix here. It's quite complete. Now the style itself is just very direct, it's unadorned, it's quite precise. And I think, as I read this, one of the things that I kept thinking about, because of the historical dimensions and all that, I thought, well, another author unnecessarily would probably have turned this story into a 500-page monster. So that is one thing that I appreciate about Los Afectos, or Affections, that it is a brief text and it gets the job done in terms of how it conveys the story and how it makes the characters really come alive with very few words. Themes. Okay, so let me mention three of them that I believe are the most important ones. We have, of course, the European view of Latin America. So I talked before about Hans and how he has the conquistador's perspective, and about Aguirre, the wrath of God, also this idea of conquering the land. The land is something that you have to bring under control. Of course, we also have the socio-political reality of Latin America, the turmoil. So we hear a lot about injustice, we hear a lot about the situations and the plight and the concern for the indigenas, the native inhabitants of the continent of Latin America. And of course, we also have, as you can tell by the story, the theme of the involvement of the outsider, which is something that I always find fascinating, because for Monica, getting involved in the struggle of Latin America is basically one way to give meaning to her life, right? And if you look at her, right, her fate is quite a tragic one. But if you compare her to the other characters, the others seem to just sink into indifference, and insignificance, I would say. So you have that there, that contrast between the character who becomes committed, whether we agree or not is a different story, of course, and the character who doesn't get involved, right? So there's that contrast right there in this text. Now, genre. Okay, you have heard me call now many times Los Afectos, or Affections, a novel. And you may be expecting me to tell you this is not really a novel, it's a novella. But for once, I'm going to tell you that I believe that that is not the case. The structure in this text is not really the structure of the novella. I believe that we have enough development here in all senses, right? The characters, the story, etc., in order to call this a novel. It is a very brief novel, on the other hand. So what I would say is that Affections is really a condensed novel. Not really the same as saying that it is a novella. Sometimes it could be the same thing, but in this case, I don't believe it is. This is a condensed novel. And what I mentioned before, I was thinking about, is when I talked about this little book, Bonsai, by Alejandro Zambra, there was something here in the back cover of this edition, an idea that was attributed to Borges. And apparently, I don't have the source for this or anything. I don't know where it comes from. I don't know if it's apocryphal or not, but the idea that is attributed to Borges here is that Borges apparently said that we should write as if we were telling the abbreviated version of a longer story. In other words, the summary as story, the summary as literature is what we have here as a kind of a subgenre. That is exactly, I think, what we have in Affections. So that is why I call it not a novella, not entirely a novel, but I would say a condensed novel. And I think that's probably the best way that I could find to describe it. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the English translation, since I was able to compare both of them because my library had copies of both. So because of the precise language of this text, it's really, I believe, from my perspective, it seems to be a very smooth transition from Spanish into English. You know, you don't have the Baroque kind of style that we are famous for sometimes in Spanish. So I really liked the translation, and I'm going to say, you know, this is a compliment for a translator, I believe, right? It doesn't read like a translation. So that is a good sign. You can read it, and if you did not know the name of the author or where he came from, you would think that you're reading a text that was written originally in English. I did notice a couple of things though. If you look at the translation into English, the titles of the chapters have been changed so that in the English version, the title of the chapter is the name of the character who is speaking. That is not the way it is in Spanish. Okay, so I wanted to clarify that. What you get here is kind of like As I Lay Dying. You know, the title of the chapter is the name of the character whose perspective we get in that part of the text. And another change that I noticed is that in the original, you're going to see that the dialogue is woven into the descriptive passages. So there is no indication that we're about to read dialogue. There are no dashes, there are no quotation marks, nothing like that. It all flows together. At the same time, you have no problem realizing when you're reading dialogue and when you are not. But if you look at the English translation, we get quotation marks all over the place, signaling the dialogue. Now, both of these changes have obviously been done with the idea of clarity, right? For the sake of clarity, I would say. But I'm going to say that I do not believe that they were necessary changes, honestly. You know, I think that I would have liked it to be more like the original text. But other than that, the translation itself, the narration, the dialogues and all that is just very well done. And I think this is really an excellent work on the part of the translator. So bottom line, Affections is one of those great novels, condensed novel in this case, that turns history into fiction. And personally, this is the first Bolivian novel that I read, but it has actually moved me to read more from this author also, because I am very pleased with the style. You know, I hope to read more by him, and I also hope and expect to read more Bolivian fiction in the future. So when I do, you are definitely going to find out about that. And as a matter of fact, I already have some more Bolivian literature to read. Now, if you're into multi-perspective works, you know, this idea, as I said before, you know, like Faulkner in As I Lay Dying, for example, I think you're really going to enjoy this one. And let me tell you, it's brief, it's 130 pages only, but it's really powerful. And it covers a lot of ground in a very reduced space in terms of page number. Do you have any questions, comments, recommendations, recipes? Just let me know. I'm always happy to hear all that. Those were my 2 cents on Los Afectos or Affections by Rodrigo Hasbún. Thank you so much for stopping by and have a wonderful day.